How should we think about inequality and why should we care about it?
Basically, every single study that looks at it has found that economic freedom matters for increasing incomes and leads to higher incomes. But the question of does economic freedom matter to inequality is still somewhat unsolved.
So what do you find when you do that? So how do you think your results connect with, real world policy debates that are happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that overall, the policy prescription of this would be increase economic freedom wherever you can have it. Hi, I'm Justin Callais. I'm the chief economist at the Archbridge Institute. I do research on economic development and social and income mobility, and this is the Cause and Effect podcast.
All right, Justin, it's great to have you here. Super excited to talk to you about your paper. We're going to be talking about economic freedom and inequality. Thank you for joining the show.
Thanks for having me on, Vitor.
So your paper looks at economic freedom and inequality. But before we talk about the details, before we talk about measurement, let's first define some terms. So what is economic freedom? How should we think about economic freedom?
Yeah, absolutely. So economic freedom is basically, at its core, the idea of economic freedom is that it's the policies and institutions that allow for free societies, that allow for people to be able to do what they feel is in their best interest. So this could mean a bunch of different things. For example, this could mean how highly are you taxed? This could mean how much is the government spending? This could mean how well, and probably most importantly, how well property rights are protected, and do you have a high quality legal system, right? Because if you don't have property rights, if there's no delineation of who owns what, then we don't really have, what really is mine and yours is a fuzzy line, right? There's no, if those aren't protected, you could easily steal something from me. I can steal something from you. The government can steal something from either of us, and there's no recourse to it, right? So if you don't have that, that's kind of one of the core tenets of it. Similarly, for legal system qualities, right? That's kind of how you are able to enforce property rights, right? If you don't have if you have a biased legal system, or if you have a legal system that's run by, political favoritism, well, then you don't really, but you have written down on paper that you have property rights. Well, if the legal system can just say, oh, well, actually, no, this isn't your property anymore, well, you don't really have property rights, right? So they both need to kind of work in hand together. Another tenet of economic freedom would be something that's very popular to talk about nowadays, free trade, right? So the idea is, well, if I want to buy something that's made in Alabama, if I want to buy a refrigerator that's made in Alabama and I live in Louisiana, I should be able to do so, right? There's a mutually beneficial exchange that happens. I value the refrigerator more than I value the $1,000 I'm spending on it. Well, that same principle should apply if that refrigerator is made in Alabama versus Germany or China or Thailand or wherever the refrigerator might be made. And obviously that one's become a little more of a hot topic nowadays, going with everything going on with the trade wars and Trump's tariffs. But the core tenet is the same, right? The principle of free and voluntary exchange is at its core what economic freedom is all about. Also, you just need a sound monetary system, right? So if your money is basically worthless, well, then your property right to that money, if you have hyperinflation or something like that, that freedom of, or your ability to have that money is basically, useless if there's hyperinflation, right? You basically are losing the property value or the property rights to that currency because it's being devalued over very quickly and over a short period of time. And finally, similarly, regulations, right? In the same way that I have, if you have a property right or you have the right to do something, well, if you want to have, reasonable business activity and economic activity going on, you need to have lower regulations or, at least very solidified, decent, not too taxing of regulations, in the idea that it allows people to basically make the decisions that they see as best. And at its core, that's what economic freedom is. It's those, different ideas, but at its core, it's about how people are able to interact with one another in a market society or in a society more broadly.
Yeah. So I can totally see why or how like philosophers would care about freedom, or people who are just politicians, or people who just care about freedom in general as a value. But as an economist, like economists seem to really care about economic freedom, and not necessarily for the reasons that we value freedom in and of itself. So like, why do you think economists study economic freedom so much and care so much about it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think overall, one of the reasons that we care about economic freedom is because, at least for me, it's one of the main reasons we've seen such a rapid increase in standards of living and a decline in things like global poverty and hunger and all of these things that we don't like, right? All the things that were essentially commonplace hundreds of years ago, and even in many parts of the world today, still pretty prevalent. And one of the reasons that that's not the case anymore is we have, broadly speaking, relative to 200, 300 years ago, 500 years ago, much more economic freedom. We have much more ability to live the lives that we see best for us. I think overall, when we think about why economic freedom matters from an economist perspective, it just increases efficiency, in my opinion, at least. It increases the ability for people to engage in voluntary transactions. And that, at the end of the day, is what I think is most important in thinking about why places are rich and why others are poor, right? Is one of the key components that tells us the differences between those two. Like I like to think of, I believe it was the economist Douglas North who said this, is once you start thinking about why some countries are rich and others are poor, it's hard to think about any other question. And that's kind of what got me into this research on economic freedom and development and mobility. Just the idea of once you think about, well, why are standards of living so much higher in the US than they are in Uganda? Or why is South Korea richer than North Korea? Well, once you start thinking about those questions, it's really hard to, try to think about other ideas in the meantime. Similarly, within the countries, right? So why is Louisiana and Mississippi and West Virginia the poorest states, while Florida and Texas and Tennessee are have rising incomes and people are moving to those areas in droves? Why is that? Well, to me, I think economic freedom can explain a lot of it because it just allows for more efficiency, allows for more market interaction, and it allows those things that we value in communicating and cooperating with one another at its best. Like it provides those tenets in the best possible way.
Yeah, I really like that you said that, because that's kind of how I got started thinking about economics and studying it. That's so what I'm from Brazil, as you know. So I came to the U.S. to play basketball. Didn't know anything about economics, but I started seeing how well people live in the U.S. It's exactly the question that you just said. It's like, hey, people live really good lives. Like jobs here are pretty good, and at least in pretty much all the places that I lived in, it's like it's very safe. People don't have fences around their houses. I literally never saw a house without a fence around it and like electric wired or whatever when I'm growing up in Brazil. And I'm like, people live incredibly well. Like, why is that? Like, why do people live so well here, so much better than people lived back home? And that's how I got into a lot of these topics. And, economic freedom, free to choose for Milton Friedman was one of the first books I read. But yeah, it's so cool how like that motivates a lot of us economists, to be thinking about institutions and economic freedom and a lot of the foundations in countries that can lead to prosperity, right? So yeah, I think it's awesome how like a lot of economists can connect on that same idea.
Absolutely. And similarly, I live in, or I'm from and live in another third world country, Louisiana. So I definitely understand the differences in what,
Yeah.
what differences in society can look like when you have good institutions and good rules of the game, which at the end of the day is what economic freedom is. If you have good institutions, you have economic freedom, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that just can explain so much of the differences in why we have different outcomes that we see across all of society.
Yeah. So when I teach my students about economic freedom, so I teach a principles class, and I talk a lot about institutions. So like we've been throwing around that term. Can you define what institutions are and how that connects with economic freedom?
Absolutely. So to me, institutions, going to again quote Douglas North here, or at least paraphrase Douglas North here, that institutions are the rules of the game. Institutions tell us the rules in which society is to function. How is society organized? In what way can we interact with one another? In what way can we not interact with one another? Right? And economic freedoms, the institution of economic freedom is basically the idea that you have voluntary exchange amongst individuals. And what this means is basically that if me and you want to interact and we want to exchange something, right? I want to buy that very nice Nike shirt from you. I can do so and you can sell it, right? So what it means is basically essentially getting out of the way to a large extent, right? Not necessarily have this kind of anarchist society necessarily, but just getting out of the way in terms of, hey, these two people want to interact. Can we make it as easy as possible for them to interact? Can we reduce the transactions cost, right? Or the cost of doing business or the cost of engaging in that transaction without some sort of, having to go through all the hoops and hurdles in order to engage in a very simple transaction. Obviously, part of that institution needs to be, having a strong property rights and strong legal system so that, to make sure that I actually really did pay you for the shirt and we agreed on the price and I didn't just show up to your house at night and take the shirt and said like, okay, well, we exchanged the shirt. It's like, well, yeah, we exchanged the shirt, but it wasn't exactly voluntary, right? I just went to your house and took the shirt and didn't give you anything in return, nor did you agree to actually sell me the shirt. So at its core, the institution of economic freedom is the idea that exchange is voluntary and people can benefit and people mutually benefit from that exchange, right? Like I buy things from Whole Foods all the time, right? And every time, even though I feel like sometimes it's pretty expensive, when I go, I feel like I valued the goods that I purchased more than the money that I spent on those products. So how can we, and if we take that sort of simple example and extrapolate it out to all transactions and all interactions, right? It's basically how can we make those transactions as easy as possible that increases efficiency, that allows resources to go to who values it most, and that allows the price system to work, right? If you have a solid institutions and you have a good foundation of economic freedom, the price system is going to matter more, right? Because it's telling us, it's really sending us a signal that is truly a signal and not fuzzied with a lot of other information that is, kind of hard to understand or hard to comprehend. When you have a price system that works, it's telling you, you're able to actually engage in transactions and know exactly what that price signal is telling the market, right? If oil prices go up or if the price to fill up your car increases, this is telling you that you need to economize on oil better, right? You need to economize. Maybe you start walking more. Maybe you bike more. Maybe you decide, okay, well, I need to use my car to get to work. So I'm just going to have to make cuts somewhere else in my budget, right? It allows you to actually economize on those things. It allows the price system and the price mechanisms to work well. And that's one of the reasons why something like sound money matters. Because if you have good monetary policy, well, then you know that for the most part, changes in prices are not going to be due to external factors that are fuzzying that system. They're going to be due to fundamental changes in supply and demand rather than, gas is now $100 a gallon to fill up because we have hyperinflation, for example. Like it's telling you, well, if the gas prices goes up, that was something to do with either the demand for gas or the supply for gas or the combination of the two. And it tells you more of the signal of the price system. And therefore you're able to adjust better and actually make those decisions in a way that you're able to economize and those trade-offs in a relatively better fashion.
Yeah. And so you described a lot of different parts of economic freedom, right? So we talked about property rights, we talked about taxes, we talked about trade. How do you measure economic freedom? So like how are we able to put all of those different parts of economic freedom together in a way that we can say that one country has more economic freedom than another, or that this country is increasing or decreasing their levels of economic freedom over time?
Oh, absolutely. So personally, my preferred way of measuring it is following what the Fraser Institute does. They have a great team that works on measuring economic freedom, and that has been since the mid 1900s, I believe, or mid 1990s. And this is the late great James Gwartney, Robert Lawson, Ryan Murphy, Josh Hall. There's been a lot of great individuals, Walter Block. A lot of great individuals have been a part of this project along the ways. And what they basically do is they say, like, hey, look, we don't want to make any qualitative decisions of just saying, like, hey, this country seems like it's freer, let's give it a higher score. They want to use real world data to be able to explain it. So they take roughly, I believe, 43 or 44 variables that actually goes into measuring economic freedom across those 5 areas that I talked about earlier. So size of government. So this is, basically how much is the government in the market in a way, in terms of how much does it tax? How much does it spend? How much, or even things like how prevalent is like state-owned enterprises, right? Because if state-owned enterprises exist, they usually explicitly or at least implicitly have monopoly rights over those goods, right? And that's basically saying, hey, we're the state, we're doing this, and essentially you can't, or if you are going to, it's going to be very hard to compete with us. So all those core tenets of size of government matter, right? They all, if you're taxed way too high, well then, whenever you're engaging in work and you're getting paid, let's say $100 an hour. Well, if you're taxed 70% on that, you're really only getting paid $30 an hour. So your incentive to continue to work and continue to improve upon your own life and engage in transactions that are mutually beneficial, which is what work is, well, that incentive is lower if you're taxed very highly. Similarly, if the government's spending a lot of money, it could potentially crowd out other spending, right? Well, if we have to tax a lot in order to spend a lot on these products or these services that we want to provide to the society, well, we're necessarily going to be crowding out other spending, private spending, because we don't know, right? What else would the market have spent its money on? What would consumers and individuals and businesses have spent their money on had the government not, taxed that much money and spent that much money in a given way? Then similarly, legal structure and property rights, that measurement is a few different variables that basically looks at how well property rights are protected, how high of quality do you have in a legal system, how are the courts, acting in the best interest of, really trying to solve the solution rather than, or base the case on the merits of the case rather than on what's the kind of goals of the judicial system, or like, what are the implicit, other factors in the judicial system that might not necessarily be exactly what a court is made to decide, right? Who is on the right side of this specific dispute? It also measures things like, is the military involved in politics and other things like that, have some merit in terms of figuring out, well, how powerful is the government in getting in the way of these other factors. So in this specific area, it kind of matters. You kind of have to play this fine line of, well, you want, or in order to have a good legal system and a good property rights, you need some sort of government spending and institutions on those property, to be able to protect those property rights and have a legal system. But at the same time, you don't want them too involved to where they're deciding each and everything, because then, one, you're increasing transactions costs, and two, you're making decisions not necessarily based on what is the best outcome or what is the just outcome in this dispute, but on, who's better politically connected, or, oh, this, in this case, this was the governor or president's cousin who was in the case, and that sways the decision of the courts. Access to sound money. That area looks at measures like inflation. And so again, with the general idea that if you have higher levels of inflation, you're devaluing that country's currency. And that is decreasing the amount of, trying to think of what's the best way to say this. Decreasing the amount of value or the property right that you have to that dollar, right? Or whatever currency you're looking at. Similarly, they also look at, which I think is interesting, standard deviation of inflation over the last 5 years, I believe, which tells you the volatility, right? Especially, and this is super important for business decisions or individual home decisions, because you don't make decisions just based off of what's best for you today, right? This is a very narrow, short-minded way of making decisions. But businesses and individuals make decisions not just for today, but for the future. So if you have high volatility in inflation as well, then you're by definition going to have more uncertainty in the future. And what we've seen with respect to in the stock markets today in the U.S. with trade wars and tariffs is that the market can sometimes handle bad news pretty well, right? They can handle the certainty of a certain tariff reasonably well, right? It's probably better that we don't have them in the first place, but if we're going to have them, knowing exactly what the policy is and knowing exactly how long it's going to be and at what percentage is it going to be and what exactly is it tariffing, markets can respond to that and adjust accordingly, right? Once you have that certainty, you can know in the price system where to value certain products or certain goods and what decisions do you make thereafter. But if there's volatility in something like inflation, well, that's meaning uncertainty. That means whenever you're taking out a loan on a business, if you're a business and you take out a loan to build a factory or you want to increase machinery or you want to move locations, well, that oftentimes you need to take a loan to do so. But if there's volatility and inflation, you don't know what interest rate to charge because you don't know if there's so much uncertainty about what you actually are paying for. You don't know exactly what's going to go on going forward. You don't exactly know okay, well, should we charge 7%, 10%? We don't know what inflation is going to be. When it's low and stable, you're able to make those decisions based on other factors that are not related to uncertainty or high inflation. And then freedom to trade internationally, at its core, is the idea that basically the easiness to transact across countries, how low is it, right? In terms of tariffs, quotas, basically the idea that there should be freedom of goods, freedom in the movement of goods and people. People should be able to move where they want to. People should be able to move goods where they want to. And then if we have, similarly, I said for inflation, if we have the sort of volatile or high levels of tariffs or trade quotas or other sorts of import taxes, we're not really getting the best we're not getting the best outcomes in terms of what exactly is being traded and at what price do we charge and how easily we can make the most efficient outcome, efficient decision as possible. And then regulation is the final fifth area. And that looks at basically regulations on the credit markets. So what are the regulations that the government puts on being able to have access to credit? Because if you have access to credit, well, then you can have a more long-standing business potentially if you're doing, if you're performing well and doing the right thing and providing a market value in the process. Same for regulation of labor. Right? How easy is it to hire and fire people? How easy is it to go about actually being in the business of hiring and deciding who's best for your firm? And then regulations on business overall. So how easy is it to start a business, right? How many steps and hoops do you have to follow? How much do you have to pay in fees or licenses in order to start a business in the first place? And at its core, right, if we believe that entrepreneurship is a big driver of economic growth, well, then that's going to matter a lot, right? How easy is it for people to start a business, right? If we view entrepreneurship as a positive net good to society, which I believe at least most people do, and definitely in my opinion, I do, well, then we should make it as easy as possible for people to be able to start their business, start their, venture or what they see as the way that they can provide for their families and provide for themselves. So that's at its core, the 5 different areas of economic freedom, and they use different databases and data sets to actually get quantitative measures of these goods so that we can get a good estimate of why is country A more economically free than country B, or are they, and how, in what regards are they? So those 5 areas, they use 43, 44 variables to get that measures of economic freedom, and then basically just average those 5 variables together, the 5 areas together, to get an overall score of economic freedom. And this kind of leads to a potential question of okay, well, what area of those matters the most? And I believe this is Robert Lawson, one of the authors, who's been an author on the Economic Freedom Project the entire time. Whenever he's asked what's the most important, he'll say, okay, well, what's the most important feature of a car? Is it the engine? Is it the steering wheel? Is it the brakes? Is it the accelerator? Well, you kind of need all of them to work, right? You really need all of them to actually function for your car to be able to get you from point A to point B. So in his view, and I share this idea that you need all of them essentially to work, right? There's no necessarily one best area or one area that is the most crucially important. If you had to pick one, I would say probably legal structure and property rights. But again, if you have if you have property rights and you have a high quality legal system, but you can't trade with people outside your country and you can't really start a business, you don't have high regulations, and you have hyperinflation, and then you have whatever you do make, the government taxes you 80% on. Well, then you have property rights, but you have property rights to not very much. So, that obviously matters. And to me, if I had to pick one, I would say is the most important, but is not necessarily the only thing that matters by any stretch.
Yeah, I really like that analogy because, like you might have all the other four, but you live in a country with hyperinflation. And then it's really tough to live, and it's really tough to trade, and it's tough to do everything really in a country like that. I really like that analogy. And also one story on how sound money, I think, makes a lot of sense for sound money to be in there. Like when I teach with students about inflation, and we talk a lot, I have at least half a class on hyperinflation. I often get the questions like, do political leaders, whatever they are, like, do they not know that once you start this trend of hyperinflation, everything, goes bad? And the answer is like, well, they do. But often when you get to that point of having hyperinflation, it's likely because that's their best way, or the way that they found to be most effective for them to tax people. So it's really difficult in Zimbabwe, for example, to go out and tax people. It's just, at that level of their economy, it's really hard for you to do that. But they got the printing machine, so they can print a lot of that and use the money before other people do. So by having, printing a lot more money and causing hyperinflation, they're enriching themselves, but they're also taking away the ability that people have to purchase things. So they're purchasing power.
Right. So, it's the Cantillon effect, right? It's the idea of who gets the money first, gets all the benefits of the extra cash, the extra liquidity, without any of the cost of the hyperinflation that comes from it. Right. So, like you said, in that case, right, of course they know. I mean, I think at this point it's pretty well known to everybody that inflation is bad, but you should not always assume an ambivalent, leader who is just trying to do what's in the best interest of the entire country. Oftentimes they're doing what's in the best interest of them specifically. And in that case, right, oftentimes if they can't tax people, or if they can't, if they don't have the structure in order to actually really, or the state capacity, if you want to call it, to tax people, well, then you have to resort to other ways in order to actually fund the things that you want to fund. And having access to the printing machine can be one of those ways. Yeah.
So if the government is taking your stuff, that is affecting your property rights. If they're taxing you, that's also affecting your property rights because I can't keep my money. But if they're printing a lot of money that takes away your ability to purchase things, that's also affecting your ability. It's also affecting you and what you can do with your income, right? So those are all clearly connected. So I really like that analogy. Okay, so let's jump into your research. So you look at economic freedom and inequality. How should we think about inequality, and why should we care about it?
Yeah, so in the same way that we often care about like standards of living, right? When we say like, okay, well, average incomes in the US have risen faster than, let's say, EU countries, for example, right? And for a lot of people, that's enough to say that, okay, well, the US is doing better than the EU in, over the last 20 years or whatever time period you want to look at. However, an often critique or response to that would be, okay, well, yes, on average, people are doing well, but also on average, me, you, and Jeff Bezos are billionaires. But in reality, only one is carrying most of the weight of that average. So it's basically trying to get a measure of how or is that income dispersed, not necessarily perfectly equal, because I don't think that's necessarily the best outcome, but how well is that dispersed across people in the society? So inequality is basically just one measure of a way to, or one way to measure that in terms of what is the distribution of income across the society, right? If one person, so this is where you get things like a Gini coefficient, where if one person owns all of the money and no one else has any money, well, then they have perfect inequality in the sense where one person owns all of the money, no one else has anything else. Similarly, if you live in a country where everyone has $3,000 exactly, well, then you have perfect equality. And the idea is, well, we know, for example, like economic freedom matters for average incomes, right? We could see this across data. We could see this across all sorts of studies, right? Basically, every single study that looks at it has found that economic freedom matters for increasing incomes and leads to higher incomes. But the question of does economic freedom matter to inequality is still somewhat unsolved. So we wanted to look at it as well, in respect to the Gini coefficient, which is what most people use, which is just the distribution of money across societies. And they have a few different ways to measure it. One is you have two ways of measuring Gini coefficients broadly. One is disposable income, which is income that is post-tax, post-transfer. So after you pay your taxes and after you receive any transfers or don't receive any transfers, how much money are you left over with? That's your disposable income. On the other hand, there's market income, and that is the amount of money that you just make as a household in that case. And that excludes any government cash that you pay or any taxes that you pay or any government cash that you receive. So it's basically just looking at what did I earn this year, pre-tax, pre-transfer? What did you earn? What did other people in society earn? I think one of the reasons that there's such this kind of fuzzy idea of exactly figuring out how bad inequality is or how much inequality is a problem is the differences between those two, because those are two very different things, right? If you live in a country that has high taxes and high transfers, well, your disposable income Gini coefficient is going to be lower than your market income, where there's people who are earning very different incomes. Some people are taxed a lot and then distributed to other people in society. But then, and we think that's a pretty good measure, right? It tells you, economists like numbers, and economists like, when you want to make a point, keeping it simple is sometimes often better. However, we viewed and we thought, myself and Andy Young, who's at Texas Tech, thought that, Gini coefficients matter, but also what matters is, what's the actual average income of people at different levels in the income distribution. So not just what's the overall distribution effects or the overall, Gini coefficients, but also, okay, well, what's the income shares that someone like in the top 1% receives, right? Of the people in the top 1%, what share of income do they receive? Similarly, at the top 10% or at any of the different deciles, what do they receive, or what's their share of income that they have? But also, to further complicate it, we also look at what's the average income that people have at those different measurements, right? Because that could be two different things, right? One country can have, the top 10% have 30% of the income, but that could be $3,000 if it's a very poor country, or that could be $100,000 if it's a richer country. So we wanted to look at all those differences as well to try to get a really as much of a overall case that we can make or assess on how economic freedom matters to inequality, very broadly defined. Because overall, most people have looked at just Gini coefficients. Some people have looked at these other measurements like income shares or average incomes at these shares. So we wanted to just look at all of it and get as wide of a understanding as possible of what are the distributional effects that happen from economic freedom.
Yeah. So in terms of having, because you're looking at different countries, right? So you got countries that might have a lot of economic freedom, countries that have less, and that's changing over time. But we know that there are also a lot of differences across those countries. They might speak different languages, they might be in different parts of the world. And for a lot of those reasons, they might have different levels of inequality. So how are you able to assess the effects of economic freedom on inequality? Because in an ideal world, we'd like to have Like this country, the real country, and then we create a fake country that looks exactly like it, and then we add a lot of economic freedom to this, right? That would be like a lab experiment with a country. Well, you can't really do that. So how are you able to assess the effects of economic freedom? Yeah, but in a non-technical way. So, like, how are you able to? Yeah, that's good. Yeah, you're good.
Yes. So the way that we try to measure as close to a causal effect that we can, right? The podcast is called Cause and Effect. So we want to see what's the causal effect of these, of the policy of economic freedom. We basically look at countries that had a large and sustained, so meaning that it lasted, that it didn't just have a short blip in economic freedom and then fell. So a large increase in economic freedom, and that actually stayed, right? So if you have an increase and then it stayed to a reasonable degree, the same policies, right? Because that initiates to us a meaningful difference in a country's economic systems and its institutions. So we look at all the countries that we have data on, and across all the years that we can obtain data from, and look at, okay, whenever you have this sort of sudden increase or this large and sustained increase in economic freedom, we want to see, okay, well, we treat that as basically a treatment. We say that is, this country was treated with the effect of economic freedom. They had a reform, a meaningful and sustainable reform of economic freedom. And then we want to say what thereafter happened with respect to inequality. But obviously, again, countries that become economically free doesn't just happen randomly. Like you said, we don't just randomly say like, okay, Taiwan, you are more economically free now, and just see what happens, right? We don't go in and, rip up all the code books and the regulations and make them more economically free overnight. So we want to say, well, how can we best compare them? So what we basically do is we find all of these countries. We look at different data points of all these countries that basically tell us this country was very similar. Let's say, let's come up with an example. Like, let's say Taiwan had a treatment in 1995 of economic freedom. And we say, okay, they had this treatment. What does Taiwan look like before they initiated that reform in terms of its incomes, in terms of its growth, in terms of its human capital, right, or its education levels, in terms of its political environment, in terms of different things that could matter for economic freedom or inequality, like fertility rates, urban population share, old age dependency, right? Because old age dependency can tell you what percentage of the population is working age or not, right? Which can matter for, obviously, people who are working age are going to be more likely to contribute to economic growth than others. So basically say, okay, Taiwan, for an example, in 1995 had this sudden, increase. What did Taiwan look like before they had that increase? And let's match them to a country that had all the same characteristics in terms of income growth, fertility, measures of democracy, human capital, all these other measures, including economic freedom. Right? Did they have similar scores and all this? We try to find the one that was most closely associated with them. But the only difference that we could find in the data is that this country, let's say Taiwan in 1995, had a treatment of economic freedom and the other country did not. So they're similar in all these other margins. They're similar in terms of its economic structure, similar in terms of its growth trajectory, in terms of its income at the time, in terms of its economic freedom scores before the reform, in terms of its democratic scores and how democratic the country was, all before the reform. Match them to for each treated country, find one or two or three of the closest matches that basically they were similar in every other regard, except for the fact that one had this reform and one did not. And then you can just compare the differences between the two. And that tells you essentially as close to a causal estimate that we could find without running some randomized controlled trial of like, all right, Taiwan, you're economically free, and this country is not economically free, and this country increases its property rights, and this country fixed inflation, and this country didn't fix inflation. right? We can't do that in the real world. We should want to in the first place because that you're muddling in people's lives, and that seems not necessarily the best outcome. So we basically try to do as best as possible to find countries that were very similar that did have the reform to countries that were very similar to the country that did have the reform, except the only difference was they did not have the reform. And then just compare the differences across the entire set of countries that were treated to the ones that were not. So what we find is basically that economic freedom, well, other people have found that economic freedom matters for average incomes and that economic freedom boosts incomes. But again, the question was, how does this affect the distributional effect? What we find is that economic freedom with respect to income shares has no meaningful effect. So economic freedom does not change who earns what point in the income distribution do people earn, what share of the income do people have. So essentially there was no differences in income shares at all across all the different tests we ran, across all the different, robustness checks and all these other things. There was absolutely no difference on income shares. So this was not making the rich richer and the poor poorer by, economic freedom was just good for the richest or was just good for the poorest. We find a tiny effect on overall income distribution using Gini coefficients. It was less than 1 point on a scale of 0 to 100. So that we find that to be basically meaningless in terms of actual magnitude, right? It doesn't substantially change too much. But most importantly, what we find is basically that economic freedom increases incomes for everyone in the income distribution. Overall, economic freedom, these reforms massively increase the growth at every single decile level. All 10 deciles, as well as the top 1 and top 5%. All of their incomes on average go up when economic freedom happens. So again, this isn't the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. This isn't the poor getting richer and the rich getting poorer. This is everyone is getting richer from economic freedom on average, right? So overall, basically everyone's benefiting from economic freedom reforms on average, right?
Yeah. So meaning that not only are they getting richer, but they seem to be getting richer by similar proportions, right? Because if it wasn't, so suppose that, people at the bottom of the distribution get a little bit richer and the people at the top get a lot, they double their income, we'd still see an increase in inequality, right? But the fact that you're not seeing that means they're getting richer by similar proportions. So everybody is benefiting, and it seems like by similar proportions. Does that seem correct?
Yes. So the differences in magnitude are very similar across the 10 deciles, as well as the top 1 and top 5%. There are some slight differences. So what we do find is that actually the poorest 30% and the richest 30% seem to be the most benefit from it. The middle class still, is performing extremely well, right? I think on average, they have their incomes rising by like 70% of a standard deviation. So, they're having massive increases, but for the poor and for the richest, it's a little bit higher. So no one's getting harmed by it, right? So, and those differences are so small in reality that it's hard to get any sort of to say that they're really meaningful and different between, what the top 30% is getting compared to the middle 40%, compared to the bottom 30%. We find some, evidence of the top 30%, the bottom 30% being a little bit higher, but overall it's so negligibly different that I think overall removing state-owned enterprises and letting private businesses take over those roles and responsibilities, increasing property rights, having higher quality legal systems. So often, for example, I'll go on a slight example. This could be something just as simple as letting the judicial system be truly independent from the executive branch. There's a lot of cases in countries where the judicial system and the executive branch are, they're technically separate in terms of what their responsibilities are, but in practice are very closely connected. and have very close relationships and are very dependent on one another. Or the judicial system is more beholden to the executive branch. So fixing something like that would go a long ways in fixing judicial system quality and legal systems and property rights. Sound money, right? Just having lower levels of inflation, having more stable levels of inflation. Free trade, probably the easiest to fix, right? Just take every tariff you have and remove it, right? I think that would do wonders for free trade. Also, they could do wonders for the economy as a whole. And regulations, right? I think that one that is perhaps underemphasized, maybe in a lot of the international discussions. A lot of it is, okay, well, let's get good inflation or good low levels of inflation, good free trade. But regulation, I think, is perhaps one of the more lesser discussed areas in the international circles, at least, because there's such this potentially paternalistic need in a lot of countries for the government to protect them from themselves. And I think a lot of those policies are well intentioned, right? They have, I like to think the best of that. Well, people are doing it because they are worried about, maybe the climate effects, or they're worried about the monopoly effects of regulation. But what you actually find is that if you reduce regulatory barriers, you actually increase competition, you increase market interaction, and you increase the amount of people who could become entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship is not just good for the entrepreneurs. There's this famous working paper that was published a long time ago that 90 to 95% of the benefits of entrepreneurship happen to society, and that the actual entrepreneurs themselves only benefit about 5 to 10% of those innovations. So entrepreneurship, if you decrease regulations, you allow for more entrepreneurship, you allow for more chances of figuring out what works and what doesn't, right? This isn't to say we need to solve this one particular problem. We need this one company to do it. You need a bunch of different tries in order to figure out what exactly is the best way to handle this, right? For example, take Uber and Lyft. So there were a lot of other, there were a few other companies that tried Uber Lyft models before they came out. So we just said, oh, well, we tried this before, it didn't work. Let's just regulate it away and make sure it doesn't happen again, because it didn't actually solve anything. That'd be doing a disservice to what those businesses were able to accomplish, because you need multiple tries at something, right? There's not always going to be the best way to do something, right? It's not like, oh, we need one manufactured t-shirts, and once we get that right, we're done. It takes a lot of bites at the apple before you actually can, figure out what's the best way to solve it. And you have this increased competition that allows for different techniques, different models, different ways in charging customers, different ways in providing access, different ways in innovating. And all those things matter. So, if you think of entrepreneurship, right, a lot of businesses fail. If you think of entrepreneurship as, a lot of throw of the die, well, if you want to succeed, right, you need as many throws of the die as possible, right? You need to take as many chances as possible in a society in order to see what actually works. So regulations, I think, just making it easier to start a business, just making it easier for people to interact. But so much of that's going to be driven by political favoritism and corporatism and crony capitalism, if you want to call it that it can tell you, oh, well, people are really trying not to, they're trying to punish would-be new incumbents in the system in order to protect the ones who already exist. But small businesses are the ones that innovate. So having those that are actually able to innovate and have a robust ecosystem of innovation and trying new things and trying to solve new problems is going to have very beneficial outcomes to the economy. One thing I'll note across this, because when you ask for specific policy prescription, I would say that what we actually find is that it's best for a country to overall improve its economic freedom instead of focusing on one specific area. So we looked at reforms of economic freedom overall, and we found massive effects. However, when we looked at reforms within the 5 specific areas, we find very kind of all over the place differences in outcomes. And pretty much it was all essentially not positive nor negative, right? There was really no substantial difference whenever you reformed just regulations or just free trade or just sound money. or just legal systems and property rights. Those can have some positive effects, but countries do best when they take an overall packet of reforms together that is in a meaningful way trying to move the country in a more market-oriented fashion. So, for example, when we look at if you just change free trade, we see very little, if any, impacts on income growth across the distribution. Sound money is the only one really on its own that matters for income across the distribution and has no real inequality effects. But overall, basically, you need to overall reform your country and overall take a more blanket array of reforms, like in the same way that someone like, Margaret Thatcher or something might have done in the UK of like, we're not just focusing on just free trade. We're focusing on all these different factions of the country in order to, in our opinion, boost the economy and allow for long run sustainable growth.
Yeah. And what I find super interesting about your research is that it kind of destroys that false trade-off that I think a lot of people seem to describe with economic freedom, which is this idea that oh yeah, we're going to be richer, but the poor are going to be worse off. And because the poor are worse off, we should sacrifice some, average income, when that's not actually a trade-off at all. People across the distribution, the poor are better off, the rich are better off, the middle class is better off. So the remaining question is just why not do it, right? And that's what we're here for. That's why we need researchers like you to get this information out there, and hopefully, some ears are going to receive this information and hopefully be a little more interested in being involved in reforms like that, both in the U.S. as well as all kinds of countries throughout the world that really need. I'm from Brazil. Brazil, people seem to think of Brazil as a middle-income country that's thriving often, but in terms of economic freedom, Brazil is not doing well. They really need a lot of reform. So this is a great country.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, I agree. I think, these reforms matter a lot, both, within countries as well as across countries. And it's really about, allowing market forces to work, right? Market forces allow the price system to work. And as economists, right, we think price theory matters, and price systems tell us a lot of information and allows, even if you don't understand the price system, people act accordingly, right? Even if we didn't understand why eggs became more expensive over the last few months, we responded accordingly, right? We, at least personally, I bought fewer eggs because eggs were a lot more expensive than before. You decide, okay, well, I'll, do something else for breakfast. And just having more of those market interactions makes us better off overall. And like you said, and like I found in the research, there's really, there's not necessarily this equality efficiency trade-off that we have to make with economic freedom. We find very little, if any, effects on inequality, but we see incomes rising for everyone across the board. And I'll, also mention a different paper, just briefly, that I did with Vincent Geloso, that found not only did, so in this paper with Andy Young, we found that economic freedom matters across the income distribution. But Vincent Geloso, we also found the economic freedom allows people to move up those deciles more easily, right? It allows for more income mobility. So it's not just that you're stuck in the middle class and you're richer, but you're not moving anywhere in the relative distribution. What we find in that paper is that you're also actually more able to move across the distribution in an easier fashion with more economic freedom.
That's awesome, man. That's I'm going to make sure that the link to this paper, as well as the paper you just mentioned, are going to be in the notes. So to the listeners who are interested, the papers are attached. You're welcome to look at those. Justin, thank you so much for joining the show and sharing all the insights from your research.
Thanks for having me on, Vitor. I appreciate it and really enjoyed the conversation.